Hello and welcome everyone. So today in this video we will create a, a new function, a JavaScript function which is fetch with a timeout. So we all know that fetch is an inbuilt API that browser gives us, which we can use to make any API calls. But like in some cases, what we want is we do not want our fetch request to exceed a particular time limit. We do not want, let's say, a fetch call, an API call, to take more than 1 second. Right. So what we want is we will create a function here, and this will be a modification of fetch. So what we will do is we will set a timeout on our fetch API call. We will set a timeout on our fetch API call, and if the fetch API call takes longer time than the timeout that we have given, we will cancel that request. So in this example, what I've given is I've given a timeout of 1 millisecond. Sorry, 0.1 second, 100 millisecond. So I've given it a timeout of 0.1 second, and when I click on it, I'll make an API call. I'll make an API call to some server, and if the request takes longer than 100 millisecond, then it will show aborted, else it will pass. So if I click here, you can see that it is getting aborted because the request took more than 100 milliseconds to pass, right? So this is a pretty useful function in cases where we want our APIs um, to be on time, and we do not want our APIs to delay, or like if even if the API gets delayed, we want to perform some operation, or we just want to abort the request and saying that now we don't want the response if the API is too slow. So like this is pretty useful in some certain specific cases. So let's try to code this up now. I've done some pretty boiler stuff here. So like I've created a button beforehand, and I've added an event listener to the button, and this is the function that we will create just now. And fetch with timeout takes a URL as its first argument, and duration, a timeout duration, a timeout threshold as its second argument. And after, if the API, if the promise gets resolved, if the promise is success, I'll just console log the response, else I'll just throw the error here. So this is the function that we just create. So I'll just create this function here. Function takes URL as its first argument, and duration or a timeout as its second argument, and this returns a promise. So I'll just return a promise here. So this will be resolve, reject, and here now let's call our fetch functions. So before calling my fetch function, I'll just create some variables here. So since I need to abort the request, so I'll create an abort controller instance. I'll instantiate an abort controller object here, and I'll abstract out my signal from this controller. Now I'll call the fetch here. I'll call my fetch API here, and I'll pass in signal here, and if the API succeeds, I'll just convert it into JSON, and I'll resolve my response here. But if the API fails, I'll reject with the error here. Now what we want is, we also want that if the fetch API takes longer than timeout, I want to abort this request. So what I'll do, I'll create a timer ID here, and I'll assign it to null, and here I will assign timer ID to set timeout, and I'll call this set timeout after my timeout is passed. So if my timeout is passed, what I'll do is I'll just abort the request. So this will only work when my timeout is passed and if the fetch API is still going on. Because if the fetch API is completed, then this line won't do anything. But if the fetch API is still going on, it will just abort the request here. So this will run after my timeout, and if the fetch API is still running, it will abort it. If it is finished, it will not do anything. So here in the response, when I've got the result here, what I'll do is, if my timeout is running, I'll just clear the timeout. If timer ID is running, I'll just clear my timeout so that it doesn't do anything. And this is, I think, the entire code. Now let's run this up and see if it works. So I have a syntax error here. What's the syntax error here at line number 11? Okay. So I'm resolving, rejecting. Let's click on it and see if it works. So clicking here doesn't do anything. Function, I need to declare it as a function, and I'll save it now, and I'll refresh this, and there's no console error. Now if I click on click me, I get reject is nothing, so I'll just get right here reject, and I'll give return response here, result here, and I refresh this again, and when I click on click me, I can see that my abort is called. Let me also write here console.log aborted, so we know that aborted is getting called. I'll refresh this again, and if I click on click me, I see aborted. Now let's say I increase the time to 1 second and run it again. Now if I click on click me, I can see that my response is there. So this is working as expected. So if my API request gets take more than 100 millisecond earlier, it was getting aborted. Now if it takes if I increase the threshold to 1 second, it gets passed and I get the response. So this was all for today. I'll see you next one.